All right.
Can you please introduce yourself?
So, hi, I'm Heather Augustine. I'm a mixer for Broadway-style musicals. The titles for that are also audio engineer, head audio, A1. And currently, I am the head audio, or A1, for the Mean Girls First National Tour, or I would be if we were actually on tour right now, since we're on pause for all of the COVID stuff that's happening right now. So,
what do you remember about the last day on tour when you found out that you're closing for now?
Like, so honestly, when we first started hearing about it, we got some safety things about like wash your hands a lot, make sure to sneeze into your arm tissue, things like that. For the actors, they were told that they didn't have to go out and sign autographs, and they were kind of encouraged not to. And if they did, to have their own Sharpies so that they didn't have to touch anything. And so it was one of those, I honestly didn't think it was going to be a big thing until Broadway announced that they were closing down for the moment. So because with New York and all of the issues that were happening there, and that was kind of the first moment of like, oh, this isn't just a flu that's going to go away. Like, this is stuff that's actually happening. So it was kind of surprising, but I say thankfully, but we had a little bit of forewarning with with Broadway posting their pause first before we did. But when we found out that we were actually going to pause, we got an email on Friday, and we were coming in to do a rehearsal. So we came in, we did the rehearsal, we put in one of the new actors who never actually got to perform in the show because we didn't do a show that night and had been officially canceled. And then we had a full company meeting where they said, these next couple stops are canceled, we'll kind of figure it out, and we're sending everybody home. So I was not expecting that there would be this much fallout to all of this.
Wow, such a short notice.
Yes. So.
Why sound?
So sound was something that I fell into. Really, everyone who does sound kind of steps into it by accident, because it is one of the newer disciplines in theater, and by new, I mean it's within the past 30 years or so. So it's still something that not a whole lot of people know about, so you almost find it by accident. And I started doing theater when I was in middle school, and then in high school, it was girls are a dime a dozen in the theater department because everyone wants to act. And so I didn't get cast in shows. And then my sister, she was also in the theater department as well. And it came down to, we both still wanted to be involved and do work on the productions and things like that. And they said, okay, well, we need someone to do lighting, we need someone to do sound. So you guys pick which. And my sister's older, so she got to pick first, and she picked lighting. So I ended up doing sound for, it ended up being most of the musicals while I was in high school, and then a fair amount of the plays that we did as well. And that fluke just continued on. My first job was at the SeaWorld San Antonio Park, and I was an audio op, so I worked on it was a cat and dog show, so you'd have a bunch of animals running around the stage and be playing sound effects for them, and you had a little like country band that was playing with a washboard and a guitar. So I did mics for them, and it was all playback music and a bunch of sound effects. And then just kept going with it when I was going to go to school for it and figuring out what I was going to major in. I was like, well, I like doing theater. I seem to be pretty good at sound, so we'll do that. And then I went to Penn State University. That's where I got my degree from. I have a BFA in theatrical design and technology with an emphasis on sound design. And that was because I met the sound design professor, Curtis Craig. They came to recruit at the Texas Thespians Festival that the high schools go to. And it was one of those where he was just this big friendly guy who was like, yeah, come on, like, see if you like it, come visit the campus, it'll be great. And went to campus and really just loved the campus. It's one of the few programs at that time that actually had a sound design emphasis. So that was another reason why I chose Penn State. Was I think out of all the colleges that I went to or looked at and applied to, Penn State was the only one that had a designated program for sound. Now there's some more. There's a program at CCM, NCSA, Penn State. Those are kind of the bigger ones. But there's I want to say for the majority of theater programs now, people are starting to add in sound. So it's far more common now than it was when I was applying to schools, where I think it probably would have been maybe 4 or 5 in the country that actually had a designated program for sound. So I got very lucky. I love Penn State, and that was a very good choice for me to go there.
I was wondering what makes a good mixer, and can you learn how to do it well, or like, is it some innate ability?
I think you can definitely learn how to do it. It's a lot of it is about storytelling. So I was a nerd when I was a kid. I loved reading. That was something like my punishment as a child was my parents would take away my books. So that was, yeah, that's the level of nerd we're dealing with right now. So I absolutely love stories, and that's really what mixing is about. It's about making sure that the audience hears what they need to hear so that they understand the story and what's happening. And it's blending the music and the vocals for songs so that you're still getting the information, but you're also getting the dynamic impact of the show itself, just in terms of volume and how everything's blending together. And everyone has their strengths. Like for me, since I came from the background of SeaWorld, where most of the music was canned or recorded, so it was just a playback track, I would say one of my weaker traits is mixing bands. Like that's something that it takes me a while to figure out, like, okay, this is being played by this instrument, or this is doing that, or like, okay, or we want to bring that out, because my training was much more focused on vocals and making sure that you could hear the people over the band and or the track, and then the track was just one level that you didn't have to mess with. So that's something that I've had to learn over past 10 years or so that I've been mixing, about how to pay attention to these things and how to figure out what sounds I'm looking for. So you can definitely learn it. It helps if you kind of have an ear for it. I feel like it's not something that everyone has, but I feel like anyone can learn it if they really want to, because musicals all have a specific kind of sound. Like you can tell that it's a musical or something like that, as opposed to like a pop song or a rap or something like that. Even shows like Hamilton, where they're more rap focused, they still have some kind of traditional musical qualities to it. So it helps if you can kind of follow that along. And honestly, most of my job is not following my own aesthetic for what sounds good, but making sure that I'm following the aesthetic of the designer and doing what they want it to sound like. So sometimes it helps a little bit if you can push your own aesthetic off to the side and say, like, okay, great, like these might be things that I look for, but what the designer is looking for is this, this, and this. So I need to focus on these things and notice when I'm being like, oh, well, this sounds good to me. And it's like, that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be focusing on these other things.
Do you need to be able to read the music?
You don't have to be. It helps me a lot, because there's things that, like I can talk with the designer and say, like, I'm not sure exactly where this cue is going, or with multiple people singing on top of each other, like who I'm supposed to be focusing on. And they can say, like, there's in Saigon, there's like a nighttime effect that happens at the beginning of Why God. And he's like, oh yeah, it's when this theme repeats. And for me, like, I could have said, can you be a little bit more specific with this? But since I know how to read music, I can play not very well, but I know how to play the piano, the viola, and the clarinet. So it's one of those that I have a couple of years of experience on each of them, which means I can read music and I can kind of work my way around it, but no one would ever hire me to play any of them professionally. But having that background, when they say, like, oh, okay, it's when the theme repeats, I can go back and say, like, okay, so this is what we're looking for. And all right, measure 5, when we hit this note after this phrase, this is what we're going for. So it helps you, for me, it helps me make better informed decisions, and I don't have to ask for as much information from the designer. They can kind of give me a breadcrumb and I can go run with it. Or because for mixing, I don't typically have a score in front of me, or I don't typically have the music in front of me. I have the lyrics, and from there, like, you can kind of feel out what the song feels like. So I would say it definitely helps if you play music. It definitely helps if you understand instruments and how they're played and what they sound like, so that if someone's like, oh, okay, we need a little bit more French horn in this part, you can be like, okay, great, like, I know what that's supposed to sound like. As opposed to, if you don't, I don't think it's the end of the world, but it definitely can help you to make intelligent choices on your own without having to ask the designer for every little bit of information.
Can you please tell me a bit about your career path? Like, after graduation, what happened next? Some of the milestones, I guess.
When I graduated in December, and I knew that I wanted to go out on tour because a couple of the students who were ahead of me by a few years, they had gone off on tour, and that was a career path that definitely appealed to me, because I enjoy loading shows in and loading them out and mixing them, and that's pretty much all that tour is. So I graduated in December, and the problem with that is most tours go out in the fall. So they typically follow kind of a school schedule where you'll get hired in the summer, then you'll go out and tech the show, get it ready in the fall, and then it'll run. Some run for years, but if it's only running for a year, it'll usually be kind of like a September to May or June type schedule. So it follows, well, at least a U.S. school year pretty well. But since summer was quite a few months off, my family's from Dallas, so I lived at home for a couple months and just sent my resume out to any email address that I could find that was remotely related to theater or theaters or something. So I ended up working as a stagehand at one of the local college auditoriums, and they did stuff like cheerleading competitions, dance competitions, band concerts, those kind of things. And so that was a good experience for me, because that was kind of my first time seeing things as a local stagehand would, because on tour, I take a show into a venue, and then you have a local crew who, they are the ones who are telling you, like, okay, so these are the things about our building, this is kind of where stuff goes, all that stuff. So working for that college was kind of a little taste of that experience. We didn't have big shows like the Broadway tours and stuff like that come through that venue, but it helped give me an idea of knowing the venue and kind of what information you should have and how that all works. And then I also did a couple shows where they were small little ones where I was the designer and the mixer. And my very first show that I did out of college was Avenue Q, so I felt like that was a little apropos for being straight out of college. And then same thing, just kept sending out resumes, because the shows that I was working on would maybe be a couple weeks or a month, depending on if I could go to rehearsals or what the tech period was like and stuff like that. And then I ended up doing a festival in New York, the New York Musical Theater Festival, which they do a lot of new shows and very raw scripts that are kind of just starting to get up on their feet. And then that took me to the point in time where tours were hiring, and then one of the other Penn State students, he had been my mentor in college, and he was going out on a tour, and they needed an A2, so he ended up bringing me, and I've been on the road for the past 8 years. So.
Wow, 8 years, that's a lot.
It is a lot. It's finally hit home kind of on this tour, because I've had some people who they're maybe on their first tour or stuff like that who are like, that's a really long time. And you're like, and now you're making me feel old. Great. Thank you so much.
And do you typically leave the show after a year or stay longer sometimes?
It depends. If the show only runs for a year, you'll only stay with it for as long as it runs. Most of the shows I've stayed with for a year. I was the A2 on Phantom. I was with that for 2 years. The show actually ran for, I believe it was 7 years total. And I was there for the second and third year that it ran. And then their shows after that, I was also on Les Mis and Saigon, which Les Mis is still going. It's currently in its third year, I believe. But it's the same design team did Phantom, Les Mis, and Saigon. So when I took Les Mis out as the A1, the thought behind that was kind of like, okay, great. Like if I do well on this show and can get this up and running, then I can pass Les Mis off to someone else, and then I can go out and tech Saigon, because if they know that I can tech a show well and get it up and running, they're just like, great, then you can pass this off, you can move on to the next one. So only spending a year on Les Mis was a little bit more planned than some of the other ones. And then Saigon was ran for 2 years, and it just closed amid all the COVID-19 things that are happening with social distancing and all that. So you typically have the option to stay longer if you want, but sometimes there's other shows that comes up that, like that was what happened with Mean Girls, was I ended up putting my resume in and getting an offer for this tour that I'm currently on with Mean Girls, so I ended up only spending a year on Saigon. So it's, if you want to stick with the show and it's going to run, producers, production management, they will be more than happy to let you run with it if you're doing a good job. And if something else comes up, then you might end up doing something else.
You mentioned sending resumes when you just applied for your very first job. How do you know where to send it to? Is there any special website for sound people?
There's, so when I graduated, there was, I think it was called Backstage Jobs. I think it might have changed its name to Offstage Jobs. But a lot of what I did, which they'll have some postings about different theaters, different places, but to get Dallas specific theaters, I Googled Dallas theaters and I made a list of all the theaters that did shows and things like that, and went and found contact information, whether that was an artistic director for the venue. If they had a sound designer, I would email them. But basically, you just kind of web stalk the different theaters and figure out who you can send an email to. And usually I would do a cover letter and a resume saying like, hey, I found your website, or found your theater, found your website. I've just graduated. I would love to do something with your show. Like, so yeah, it's one of those where it's a numbers game, where I would say probably 75% of the resumes that I sent out, I never got a reply back from. And that could have been that the mailbox wasn't actually in use anymore. Somebody just saw it and they're like, yeah, we don't need this. Or they just didn't see it. So if someone's out there looking for jobs, it's one of those, keep sending emails. Eventually, if you send 100, there's at least going to be a couple who will respond back to you.
Are mixers within the letters department, or is it your own sound department?
So to be on tour, I'm part of a union. I'm part of the IATSE union, and that's for stagehands. It's the, let me see, I wrote this down so I would not get it wrong. It's the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, which I should know that off the top of my head, but everyone just calls it IATSE, so I had to make sure that it wasn't theater, stage, I don't know. So since I'm part of that union, I have to be, because we go into union venues to put the show in, and there's a lot of union venues where you can't go work in them if you are not a union member. So that's just typically one of those blanket things that most stagehand crews on a show are required to be part of IATSE, and that's something that when the show hired me, I was not part of it. So that was part of the hiring process, was them essentially buying me into the union so that I could work for them. And under IATSE, sound is technically a subset of electrics. So usually that's kind of ignored. Most houses will still have a designated head electrician and head audio, and almost all tours have a designated head electrician, head audio, and two completely different departments. But technically, the head electrician can every once in a while be like, well, I'm technically your boss. But it's something that I would love to see an electrician mix the show, and nobody wants to see me try to program a light board. So everyone's better off in their own areas, but we still are technically part of electrics. We're not our own department. I was told, I asked a union rep at one point what the process would be for sound to become its own department, because it is becoming its own distinct entity. And the response I got was like, oh, that'll never happen in your lifetime. Like, cool. Not the question I asked, but great. Good to know that it's that impossible. Wonderful. So everyone just, or a lot of places kind of ignore it. If you have some older, well-established locals, they still have, as a head audio, if I'm going to talk to a venue to advance the show, I will still have to talk to the head electrician, and then the head electrician will forward me to the head audio. So sometimes you have that, but a lot of times everyone just acts as their own entity and calls it a day.
Can you please describe different positions on the sound team and their hierarchy?
Sure. So the head of the sound department is the sound designer. So they are the ones who are in charge of all the sound for the production. They pick what gear they want to use, and usually they pick it by what they're familiar with, what they like the sound of, or if they want to do something specific, they'll pick it based on if it has that ability to do whatever they want to make it do. They do all the sound effects. They're in charge for basically collaborating with the director to figure out what the general aesthetic for the sound of the show is. And then you have the associate and assistant designers, and they'll help the designer. They'll take care of paperwork, logistics, whatever the sound designer wants. Like if they don't particularly like doing sound effects, the associate or the assistant might end up being the one who sources those and does it. It changes depending on who you have or what the personalities are in the department. And so the difference between an associate and assistant that I was told, since they're very similar positions, is that the associate has autonomy and can make decisions on behalf of the sound designer, while the assistant doesn't have that autonomy and would have to ask the sound designer for permission before they do something that would change the show or things like that. So sometimes the job of an associate might be, if you're remounting a production, the associate will take it, do the majority of the tech, and then the designer will kind of come in, do a spot check, make sure that everything's the way they want it to, but the associate can make the majority of the decisions on their own. And then after that, you have the production audio, who, this is the person that they take care of a lot of the nuts and bolts of the system. They take care of taking the gear that the designer wants and figuring out what the system flow is going to be for it. And sometimes the associate might also do this. This is kind of a point where it's a little bit fluid, but typically the production audio is going to be the person in the sound shop who's saying, we're using X, Y, and Z gear. Like, this is all the cable that has to connect. These are all the connection points that we're looking for. This is the general infrastructure, like all the little bits and pieces of how practically this system is going to work is what the production audio does. And so we'll do, for each new show that goes out, you do a shop build, which means that it's usually the sound crew, so the A1 and the A2, and then the production guys, sometimes even the associate will be there. And then you have some other overhire help who will come in, and that's when you take all the bits and pieces, all the gear, you put it in racks, you make up all the connections, you make sure that everything works, you make sure that you have everything that you need, and the production person is in charge of making sure that that goes fairly smoothly and you have everything that you need. So once you get into tech and actually running the show, the head audio or the A1 is the head of department once the show gets running. So they're the person that's in the theater for every day, making sure that if something breaks, they can get something different from the shop. If anything's going on that they might need to talk with the associate or the designer or production about gear or decisions that are being made and things like that, they're kind of in charge of making sure that the department runs smoothly. And then they also mix the majority of the shows. So typically, most shows will do an 8-show week. And so a lot of times the A1 will mix maybe 5 or 6 of the shows, and then the assistant will mix the other 2 or 3. On tour, since you're constantly changing venues, the head audio is also the one who's responsible for advancing. So they're the one who will talk to the next couple venues that are coming up saying, hey, like, this is our system, this is anything that's kind of special that we might need extra stuff for. How do we fit into your space? Is there anything special? Because each space is a different size. There's sometimes where the stage space is really small, so the audio racks have to go down in the basement. Or there was even one time where we put them out in the house behind a curtain because there was literally no space. So it's kind of figuring out, like, great, what is weird about your venue that we have to work with, and what is weird about my system that you don't normally have to deal with. And then you have the assistant audio, or the A2. So they'll take care of all of the backstage stuff. They're the one who makes sure that during the show run, comm is working, video is working, all the mics are functioning and in the right places on people. If there's a show track where they have to do mic swaps or something like that, they'll run that. And then they also cover for the mixer. So they'll do the other 2 or 3 shows a week that the mixer doesn't do. And then you also have a local or house track, which is someone who typically stays with the theater. So when you're touring, you usually have a local crew that you'll work with. And so it's part of that local crew who they make sure that everything is running for the house. So like program feed backstage so that the actors can hear what's going on with the show. If there's a show track that the A2 doesn't run, then the local will run that. And usually, ideally, if you can make it so that the A2 doesn't have a track, that is very helpful, because that means that the A2 has complete freedom to, if something is wrong, they can go right and fix the problem. They don't have to worry about doing a swap in the middle of making something work. And also, since they come out and mix the show, that helps that they're not leaving a track behind backstage, or that the A1, who they don't spend as much time backstage. So I know when I have to go learn the backstage track for the first couple shows, I'm like, someone should probably show me what's going on, because I'm not entirely familiar with this. And honestly, I think that the A2 kind of has a harder job when it comes to show run, because not only do they have to be able to fix things on the fly backstage at a moment's notice, but they also have to have the ability to mix the show very well. It's usually not as well as the A1 or the mixer, because they're not out there mixing the show as much as the A1, but they still have to be able to do it to the design and in a way that people aren't going to complain about how the sound or how the show sounds when they're out there. So it is a very specific skill set, and there are some people who are very good at it. And I know, like, I am passable as an A2, but I am definitely better as an A1.
How do you collaborate with the sound designer as A1?
So it depends a lot on the designer. So it's usually you'll I'll try to talk with them as much as I can to get a feel for kind of what they like to do, what they're looking for. But you have some that their sign of faith of you is that they're not at the desk. They are off taking care of other things. They're listening how the show sounds around the theater, and that's kind of their sign that they trust you. You're doing it the right way. They're not coming to bother you. Which, when you have ones who come in and check on you, that's definitely a little bit of culture shock, because I had that going from Saigon to Mean Girls. Brian Ronan, the designer for Mean Girls, like, he would pop by the console every once in a while and be like, "What did I do wrong? Why are you here?" But so it really depends on kind of how they're doing. And usually you'll get some time to talk with them, because they want to make sure that you know how the show sounds and that they can trust you to take care of the show on your own. So usually you'll spend some time talking, and that's also a conversation that you have with the associate a lot of times, where they'll kind of work you through some bits and pieces, and you'll do note sessions with them if there's things that you need to work on the mix or that they might want to change. They'll do notes with you after previews and things like that. But the collaboration is really, a lot of it happens during tech, at least for me, because the past couple shows I've been on, I haven't had a lot of time to be in rehearsals or anything like that. So I'm sure that there's another point where, when you have that opportunity, you can also talk with the designer and kind of take a look at things in that aspect as well. But a lot of the times it's kind of in tech and basically being like, okay, cool, like, this is great, cool, we're gonna run with it. But a lot of my job is making sure that I know what the designer wants. So that sometimes involves conversations, that sometimes is like, okay, great, like, you're not saying anything, so we're gonna keep going until you tell me otherwise. But a lot of times with moving shows, every designer has a slightly different way that they like to do things. And sometimes they have different equipment that you're not used to using, because with Mick Potter shows, which are the Phantom, Les Mis, Saigon, all of those, he usually goes with a Meyer system, which is a speaker manufacturer, where Brian Ronan, he typically uses L acoustics. So switching from the McPotter system to the Brian Ronan system was switching different software that they use to predict, a different sound of show, that kind of thing. So it's one of those that trying to switch gears like that was something that when they were timing and tuning the system, I would walk around with Brian and he would kind of be like, okay, like this is what we're looking for. Like we had an SPL meter and he's like, okay, like this is consistent. We're looking for this back to front, across the side. And then once the show is going, because I'll usually do a speaker prediction for most of the venues that we go to. Some of it might change on site, but I at least like going in with a plan. And that's something that I'll usually check in with the associate and say like, okay, this is what I did for the venue. Does this look like what you want it to look like? So taking the time to have that dialogue until they are comfortable with the fact that I know what they want. So usually it's for the first 3 or 4 venues or something like that. They'll chime in and be like, okay, no, you want to tip this up. You want to look at this. This is what we're looking for in terms of spread. And then after a while, it's one of those like, yeah, I haven't looked at it. It seems like it's fine. Great, cool. So it's just talking with them a lot helps you to get an idea, but it's one of those that, especially after having done multiple shows with McPotter, I knew what he was looking for the most part, and so they didn't have to have as many conversations with me. We didn't have to have as many note sessions because they knew that I was figuring out what was going on, and then they could just let me run with it, and then if they had little tweaks that they wanted to do, then we could do that.
How do you customize your mixing script?
So I like to do a lot of color coding. For me, that helps me figure out what's going on for a lot of the time. And I will actually retype my entire script. And that's part of how I learn how to do the show is that I'll take the libretto or whatever. And I have my own format that I like. So retyping it means that I have complete control of, I can choose where the end of the page is, so I can make sure that a page turn happens at a good spot where I'm not scrambling to try to figure everything else out. And everyone has their own way of doing things. Some people like handwritten. I personally prefer to have my script typed because that for me is just neater, so I don't have to try to decipher what my handwriting said at some point. And I put most of my information in the left margin. So you have, on the one side, you've got the character, the dialogue, and that goes down. And then in the left margin, I have when cues are happening, if there's any band moves, that kind of thing. Because that, for me, since in Western culture, we read left to right as kind of, I have all the information at the first place that my eye is going to go. And that makes it easier for me. And then with the color coding, I have that mic notes and faders are red. The band is usually has a number in a purple box to tell me where the band should be on the fader. Verb, same thing, but in a green box, so I know what's going on. I have yellow, which is kind of the pay attention, look out, something's happening that you need to pay attention to. And that's after a very long time of years of redoing my script, and it changes a little bit with every show because I'm able to streamline it a little bit, or the show requires something notated a little bit different. So they change every show for what I'm doing. But when now that I've developed a consistent color scheme, I don't have to have notations about like band at this level. I know purple box, that's band. Like, so it's a little bit cleaner for me, and it's less things that I have to read. So I'm personally a big fan of color coding. However, I also had to teach the show. So our mixing sub who came out to train right before we ended up canceling the summer for COVID, he's actually colorblind. So having a color-coded script did absolutely nothing for him. And so he had me just be like, can you just take all this stuff out and then send him a blank document and he could put in whatever he wanted. So it doesn't work for everybody, but personally, I really like color coding.
That's such an interesting point about being colorblind. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, that was, because I had actually worked with him before. His name's Tyler Foster. I had worked with him before. He had taken over for me when I left Phantom as the A2 to go be the A1 on the Dirty Dancing tour. He left being the A1 on the Dirty Dancing tour to take over for me as the A2 on Phantom. So it was a really weird like flip-flop, because at that point Phantom was a bigger tour, So it was a step up for him to move even. It's difficult. I don't want to say taking a step down to be an A2 because they're two different jobs that require different skill sets. So it's not really a step down, but being an assistant versus a head of department, in that sense, it's kind of a step down. But for him, he was moving to a bigger show, so it was a good step for him. And then for me, I wanted to start being an A1 on shows. So it was, even though I was moving to a smaller show, I was moving up to being the head. So it was one of those weird crisscrosses. So he and I have known each other for a while, and I did not know that he was colorblind until he was like, yeah, your script doesn't do a thing for me. I can't tell what's going on. So it was one of those random things you find out about people.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost track of time, so I kind of checked. Do you have time left for one more question?
Yeah, do it. I've got plenty of time.
Okay, so how does a mixer contribute to the show? And what are some of the common misconceptions about what you do?
So one of the biggest misconceptions about mixing is the fact that everything's pre-programmed. We just push buttons. It's a very technical thing, which is not the case. The mixer has a very artistic job, which most people don't realize. We do what's called line-by-line mixing. So whenever someone's talking, their mic is up, and when it's not, their mic is down. So you're doing a lot of back and forth, up and down with faders throughout the entire show. And then on top of that, when you have music happening, so there's a song, you're taking the level of the actors and mixing that with the orchestra levels. So you're trying to make sure that you can understand what the actors are saying, but you still have that big full orchestral or band or orchestra sound that's supporting them, and you still have dynamics in it. So there's a lot that goes into mixing that most people, they don't think about, because like with lighting and scenic, those are tangible things that you can tell. But with sound, it's something you have so many different people coming from so many different backgrounds of it, where you have people who, like, they might be starting to lose their hearing. You have other people who can hear really well. You have some people who, I think one of the biggest issues that sound people have is the fact that people don't know how to listen anymore. Because you have, like, I have the same thing with my parents where they have TiVo. So anytime they don't hear something, they'd be like, wait, rewind that, go back, I didn't hear that. But in a show, you don't have that. So you have a lot of people who aren't used to having to actively listen to a show. And so they'll sit there and be like, oh, I couldn't hear it, it wasn't clear. And you're like, it was, it just wasn't as clear. And like, if you missed part of it, then you just didn't get it, and you have no way to go back and rewind it. So sound people have a lot to battle just in terms of trying to find a good cohesive sound that can make everyone happy, which is not possible. Unfortunately, it is very much not possible. But it's something that the mixer has so much to do with helping to shape the show, because they're in charge of everything that you hear. So they're making sure that you can hear all the lines, so that you're understanding the story, you're getting the plot points. If multiple people are singing at the same time, they're making sure that you are hearing the bits that you're supposed to be hearing. If there's new information that's coming, you're hearing that over maybe someone that's just repeating a line or something. So they have essentially complete control over what you're hearing. And if you don't have a good mixer, unfortunately, lines get muddy where you don't hear things. It's not blended well. And there's an amazing amount that you miss when you don't have the correct dynamics with the show, because that does so much emotionally for the show that a mixer can contribute. So having something like that where you have people who are just like, oh, it's just putting up faders, and it's like, that's not what it is. So that's an interesting thing. And it's something with the Tonys where you have people who, they ended up getting rid of the sound Tony for a while because people didn't understand what sound design was. They didn't know how to evaluate a good sound design versus a bad one. Um, so that's something that I think we're getting better, where they brought the sound design Tony back, and it's kind of like, okay, great, we're going to try to educate people so that they can understand what's happening or what they might be listening for. Because in some shows, the fact that you don't notice the sound means that the mixer is doing their job right. It means that you're focusing on the actors. You're not getting pulled away by like, I couldn't hear that, or the band was overpowering them or something like that. And then we also have the problem where if it's good, it usually gets credited to the actors in the band. If it's bad, the sound person gets blamed for it. I have a review from when I did Les Mis that I absolutely love, and it's the epitome of this, because it's this woman like just going on in epic poetic language about how amazing the band was, and like it fills the entire theater and it sounds gorgeous, and the music director did so much, and the voices of the actors were so pure and clear that you couldn't believe they were coming from mere mortals. And you're like, hi, the mic, it's not entirely them. Like, can we just make that point? And then right underneath that, she was like, yeah, it was kind of hard to hear a couple lines, so they might want to look at the sound. It's just like, okay, cool, great. No way to win. So you have things like that where you're kind of like, all right, go with the flow. I will take the win from that. You thought that everyone sounded angelic and all of that was great. But it's the biggest battle we fight, I think, is that people just don't understand what we do for a lot. And honestly, that's why it's great to do stuff like this, because people don't know we exist. So having your series is amazing because people can hear about these things and maybe learn a little bit about sound and what's going on that nobody thinks about.
Thank you. I was wondering, if I go to see the same musical, but the mixer is different, will it make a huge difference?
It shouldn't. So the theory is that you have typically the A1 who's mixing the show, and then whoever is coming in to cover for them. Ideally, there should not be a difference. It's something that sometimes there are small differences, because usually since in a touring aspect where you have the A1 is mixing 5 to 6 shows and the A2 mixes 2 to 3, you might have some differences in terms of finesse, because where I do the show 6 times a week, I know exactly when these actors are going to get louder, exactly when they're going to get quieter. As long as they're consistent, I know what to expect, and I know how to adjust and how to augment to make them sound as good as I can. But if you have the A2 who hasn't done it that often, they're not going to be keyed into all of that quite yet. It should always be a good mix. That's always the hope. But it's possibly, if you see a show that the assistant is mixing, it might be lacking a little bit of finesse. I would say that hopefully it's something that if you're used to mixing shows, you would probably notice. But if you're your typical audience member who appreciates theater but doesn't necessarily understand everything about kind of the flow of shows and how you would push things, you probably wouldn't notice.
Okay, last question, because it's pretty late and I want to keep you here forever.
No, that's fine.
Give me 1 second. I'm just choosing. What do you prefer, to talk about how you organize a show when you're programming it, or about that amazing picture from the Sound Girls article? It's up to you.
Let's do distress. I like that one. So there's a picture that I absolutely love. It's a great way for me to try to explain to anyone who doesn't really do theater what my job is like during tech. And it's a picture where the US assistant is the one taking the picture, and it's me at the board. It's the UK sound designer, Adam Fisher, and next to him is the sound designer, Mick Potter, and on the other side of Mick Potter is Sir Cameron Mackintosh. So the Sir Cameron Mackintosh presents Les Mis, Saigon, all of these. His name is on the marquee. I want to say I think he's the first theater producer to hit a net worth of $1 billion or something like that. And he's standing within 5 feet of me. And not to mention that also the US designer Josh Hummel, who's taking the picture, they're all within 5 feet of me. And these are all people who could be like, yeah, she's not doing a great job. We might want to look at firing her. So if they didn't like me, I Like it's a very high pressure job because you're sitting there, and Sir Cameron is very particular because it is his name on the marquee, and it's kind of amazing. Like, no matter how many times his shows have gone out, he is always there for the last little bit of tech to make sure that it's the way that he wants it to be. So he's sitting there and he is not shy about telling you if there's something that needs to be changed. So he's probably talking with with Mick, the sound designer, a little bit, and so Mick and Adam are both adjusting things on the console, and then Adam, who's standing next to me, is also talking to me about okay, push that a little bit more, bring that back, and giving me notes on the mix while I'm trying not to miss any pickups and keep a mind to all the things that he's telling me to also try to remember them for later so that I can either make a note or replicate it in the next. So there's a lot going on. And it's something that I appreciate having that picture, because the fact that Josh was able to go off to the side and actually take the picture meant that things were going well enough that he wasn't on the other side of me, also in the thick of things, trying to make sure that everything was not completely running off the rails. And so the job of a mixer is inherently high stress because we don't have a safety net. That's something like actors, they can ad lib or something if they miss a line, but you can't get a fader up after a line has already happened. Like you have to be on the ball and you have to hit your mark. And there's no way, if you miss a pickup, everybody knows. So it's something that it takes a little bit to learn how to deal with that stress. And that's something that I personally actually like, that stress, like because during tech is one of my favorite times because it's the first time you're learning the show. Everyone's doing it for the first time. And there's just a little bit of extra adrenaline and energy. And I kind of enjoy that stress. And I had my A2 on Les Mis, Mark Rivet. He and I were a very good match because we were a very good complement of skills. And we had a conversation where I was talking about, it's just I actually kind of enjoy that stress. Like it gives me a little bit of energy. I enjoy doing that. And he was like, oh no, that's horrible. I hate that. Like I would rather be backstage putting out fires, actual fires, than having to deal with all of that stuff. And it's like, that's great because I have zero desire to go do that. That sounds horrible. So everyone has their own tolerance for stress, and everyone has a different tolerance for different types of stress. And that's something that with mixing, you kind of have to learn to just go with the flow. And it's something, the article that you were talking about, it's titled Striving for Excellence, because unfortunately in our job, it is almost impossible to be perfect. So it depends on so many different things. It depends on you, it depends on the orchestra, it depends on the actors, it depends on everything coming together. And there's so many variables. But what we can do is strive for excellence. So that's the thought, that you come in every day with the intention of doing your best job. And if something happens, you give yourself some grace and you let it go and you move on. And that's, for me, that's one of the best things about sitting there with all of these people surrounding me, is the fact that I can say, I am here, I'm going to do the best job. If they want to change something, they will give me the note. I don't have to worry about that. I will do the best job. And when you come to every show with that, it just becomes a normal show. It doesn't matter if there is a billionaire producer standing next to you, or if you're there on your own just jamming out to the show. If you always do your best, then you don't have to stress. You don't have to worry about oh, well, I usually don't do this, but I have to make it happen this time because he's standing here. And that's also for the audience. It's a new audience every single show. So you're also trying to give them the best show every single time. And so that's one of the things that you kind of have to keep in mind that helps. Also, a couple deep breaths never hurts. I'll usually try to do something easy, like an easy crossword, or fiddle with a Rubik's Cube, something that I can keep in my hands to mess around with. And that's something that I can just put off to the side, start mixing the show, and we're good. But that helps to get rid of some nervous energy for me that I might have to deal with. And that's something that also, as you do more, as I've mixed more and more shows, you become more comfortable with your skill set. I've learned to trust in my ability and the fact that I know what I'm doing, I'm good at my job. And if someone wants me to change what I'm doing, they will tell me. And at the same time, when you work with people, because like I was talking about that I did 3 shows with the same design team, and that's also the same set of producers, similar directors, things like that. And so you have people who they get used to working with you as well. And if once they have a familiarity with you and the fact that you always try to do your best, they'll usually give you more grace than you'll give yourself, because they'll be like, oh yeah, you had it, like you missed that pickup, but like I know you missed it, you know you missed it, cool, don't miss it again and we're good. And so they'll actually kind of take whatever you give to them. If you consistently give them a good show, they will expect that from you, but they'll also be a little bit more forgiving if you don't. And if you constantly do really bad shows, that's when they'll probably sit there and be like, yeah, we might have to talk about your career path. But yeah, so it's a lot of stress, but it can be a fun stress depending on what you like to do.
Well, thank you so much for making time for me. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. No, this was a lot of fun. I'm very glad I got to do this. All right.